Okay. Erev Tov again, and we are on Naso essay number 3, the laws of the Nazarite. And I think as I continue to reflect on the ways in which learning with Nechama Leibowitz virtually differs from our other essays, I mean, just clear that if you skim through, many of our essays are 5 to 9 pages, but on a kind of spectrum, I guess Aviva Zornberg quoted small sections. Rav Meidan sometimes would quote 1 or 2 large sections. Rav Shai rarely, if ever, quoted more than a line or 2 consecutive of text. And just visually, when we flip through Nechama section, we see it's almost more than 50% citations, and she's really kind of narrating for us what the the sort of journey through the texts, but the primary experience is encountering the texts, on their own. I think that's a way in which the analysis is less, and the presentation of sources is more. And we that doesn't necessarily make it more simplified because there's less analysis. So that's just a reaction 3 weeks in. So here we go, Laws of the Nazarite. This Sidra contains a strange chapter dealing with the laws of the Nazarite, which have excited the attention and interest of many commentators. She begins with a series of excerpts that's going to take us over into the second page of the first 11 verses. We have it here as well, from Numbers chapter 6, and we'll read her excerpts. God spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when either a man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazarite, to separate themselves unto the Lord." And we'll just take a moment on that pasuk. Isha, a man or a woman, ki yafli, who will separate themselves, lindor neder nazir, to vow the Nazarite vow, or literally vow the vow of a Nazarite. And then lihazir, we might translate as to Nazaritify themselves to God, because it's from the same root. She chooses not to translate the word Nazir, just leaves it the vow of a Nazarite. But then she does translate lihazir as to separate themselves. I think that's going to be important later on. So the introduction to what this Nazarite vow is has the noun Nazir and then the verb to make oneself a Nazarite, but she translates that here as to separate oneself unto the Lord, separate oneself, right? In the direction, separate oneself. In separating, you could separate yourself from something, to something, or both. And here it's the direct, having separated oneself from something else, we're going in the direction of God. Okay, what's the content of the vow? One should separate oneself from wine and strong drink. Drink no vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink, nor any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dried grapes. All the days of their Nazarite vow, there should be, or here again, vow of separation. No razor should come to his head. And of course, we note that even though the introduction says ish o isha, a man or a woman, then the text speaks in the third person masculine singular, not to exclude or imply that this wouldn't be the same for women, but it just adopts the conventional masculine subject here. So no razor should come upon his head until the days are fulfilled in which he separated himself unto the Lord. He shall be holy. Let the locks of his hair grow. So again, we have the restriction on what one drinks. We have the restriction on hair cutting, also articulated in the affirmative, let the hair grow. All the days of his separation, he's holy unto the Lord. If any man die very suddenly by him, and he defiles the head of his consecration, then on the 8th day he brings 2 turtles or 2 young pigeons. The priest offers one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, to make an atonement for him, for that he sinned by the dead. We're going to see that more closely. a sin offering and a burnt offering, atoning for him, me'asher chata al hanefesh, for having sinned by the dead. I'll just take one more moment to note that as we look at it in context, it's important to see that what she quotes takes us up to verse 11, and then verse 13 gives us a new set of sacrificial instructions. This is the instruction regarding the Nazir. This is Professor Everett Fox's translation, so things are a little bit more, I don't know what the right adjective is, a little more literal. He calls the Nazir the consecrated one, in caps. On the day that one's days of being consecrated are fulfilled, then we have another set of offerings. So it seems to be the case that the offerings that she cited that take us up through verse 11 have to do with what happens if during the course of the Nazirite vow, one comes in contact with the dead. Like it seems to interrupt the Nazirite status and require some reaction. And that could happen or not happen. If indeed that, whether it does or doesn't, then the sacrifices described from verse 13 and on are the ones at the end of the Nazirite period. So there are offerings that would be offered on the circumstance of coming in contact with the dead during the Nazirite period. Whether that happens or doesn't happen one way or the other, there are a set of offerings that are brought at the conclusion of the Nazirite period. Okay, going back again. Okay, so we really just introduced her particular choice excerpts of the opening 11 verses of the description of the Nazirite. What is the significance of the Nazirite vow in, the Torah? Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik in his treatise Isha Halacha, the halachic personality, more commonly translated as halachic man, published by the WZO Department for Torah Education, Jerusalem 5739, and Isha Halacha Galoi V'Nistar, describing the characteristics of the religious personality. And by the way, for those who were not in the room for the armchair conversation with our scholars in residence over Shavuot, Dr. Ari Gordon and Shuli Taubis, I asked them about their favorite teachers or Jewish texts that influenced them, and Shuli spoke about halachic man. So we have here a through line from our Shavuot learning to here. So in Isha Halacha, describing the characteristics of the religious personality in a general sense, the Rav states as follows: the aspiration to achieve a state of ecstatic transcendentalism, the negation of life in this mortal world, the annihilation of existence and reality, the reaching out of the religious personality to the ethereal world that stretches beyond the confines of tangible existence, is embodied in many of the systems of conduct involving asceticism, vows of abstinence, and withdrawal from society. Here we're not speaking specifically about Jewish frameworks, just talking about this human aspiration. The religious personality sometimes imagines that afflictions, suffering, fasts, and solitude constitute the media bringing immortal happiness to man. Here, media being used as the plural of medium, not quite in the way we use media today, not like the news media, but the means, the medium plural, bringing immortal happiness to man. According to his outlook, the man who withdraws from the world and forgoes earthly and ephemeral pleasures is rewarded with eternal life and a sublime spiritual existence. So this is sort of the setup for the question, is this what the Nazirite is about? Right? So she asks the question, what's the significance of the Nazirite vow in the Torah? She offers us a framework which doesn't mention the Nazirite specifically, but just says sometimes people aspire, or see that through various kinds of negation, limitation, asceticism, they might achieve a transcendent state, and that a religious personality sometimes looks upon the world that way. Is this then the aim of the Nazirite laws in our Sedra? Are they meant to embody those ascetic rites by which man is brought nearer to a sublime spiritual existence? Okay, so it's just interesting to think about. Very often, I think she'll just come right in by quoting, classic medieval commentaries or a midrash. here she sort of sets up the question by exposing us to Rav Soloveitchik's, framework and asking, is that the goal of the Nazir? Because having called it strange at the beginning, it's clear to us that she's, wondering, coming from a position of saying, how does this fit into the Torah? What's the purpose of this opportunity? It is possible to detect a favorable attitude to the Nazirite in our Sidra, though it should be noted that the Nazirite in the Torah merely refrains from wine and grapes and any of their products from the kernel to the husk, and his vow does not involve abstinence from other bodily pleasures, right? So if we want to put this in the framework of asceticism, affliction, fasting, etc., it's narrow within that framework. There's lots of other stuff you could be abstaining from that the Nazir doesn't abstain from. But she says it's possible to detect a favorable attitude to the Nazirite in our Sedra. She hasn't yet answered the question of whether, yes, this is the format or the framework. She's now sort of taking another consideration. How does the Torah view the Nazirite? For surely the Nazirite is here regarded as being on a higher spiritual plane, just as he that is the high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, that is the Kohen Gadol. Like the Kohen Gadol, and so now she's going to quote us a couple of sections from our chapter 6, the story of the Nazir, or the laws of the Nazir, and then ask us to consider their parallels. Having told us that there are parallels, she's going to quote the passages about the Nazir, and then tell us, go look for the parallels to the high priest. So about the Nazir, we're told, he shall come at no dead body, not make himself unclean for his father or mother, because the consecration of the Lord is upon his head. And it also says about him, he shall be holy, he is holy unto the Lord. Compare the laws of the high priest. Now, in many instances, when someone refers to a text we should look at, I wouldn't necessarily go there. But here, she's given us the setup, but not the counterpart. So I think we should go there, looking for parallels about not becoming, impure from coming in contact to the dead, even for family members, and being called holy to the Lord. So Leviticus 21, 10 to 12. So this is what she quoted without giving the source reference. The priest who is greater than his brothers, who has had poured on his head the oil of anointing, not to come in the presence of any dead persons, even for his father and mother, not make himself tameh, almost word for word. And then we have, I am the Lord who makes him holy. I don't think we have any more explicit mentions of holiness in this section. But we have that reference, and we have the prohibition on coming in contact with the dead, even for one's own relatives. So compare the laws of the high priest. So thus far, she set up for us the idea that the Nazir is viewed favorably for, a comparison to the high priest shows various parallels. Pausing for a moment. Get back. However, a closer look at the chapter will reveal that the favor with which the Nazir is viewed is not altogether unreserved. We find that his sins are explicitly referred to. The priest shall offer one, this is verse 11, priest shall offer one for a sin offering and one for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him that he sinned by the dead. Okay, that's a reference, as we said, to what happens when he comes in contact with the dead in violation of his Nazirite vow. So that's the notion of sinning there isn't as much, doesn't seem as clearly a criticism of the Nazirite vow, even if it's an accident. We're saying that he wasn't able to keep the terms of his vow. It seems like less of a judgment of the vow or condition itself. Similarly, when the days of his separation are over, he has to bring his sacrifices to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And again, we read, he shall offer his offering for a sin offering. Okay, so while I'm less convinced by the first of the two examples of sin offerings, because that's one where, even if inadvertent, the terms of his vow had been violated by coming in contact with the dead. But even if that never happened, even if he had an blemished Nazirite vow period, when that term comes to an end and he offers an offering, he offers this sin offering. That's her way of demonstrating that the text's favorable view of his Naziritehood is not unreserved. Now she wants to spell it out. What constitutes then his sin? Our sages of old differed in their evaluation of the Nazirite in the Talmud, and two opposing schools of thought find support for their opinions in the wording of this chapter. And again, of interest to me is kind of the question, what, like pedagogically for her, what's the purpose of sort of the lead up? Or why not just start with this section? What is the status of the Nazirite, and how do we view his Naziritehood? Well, the sages had two different opinions, but she takes us on a little bit of a background journey to get there. Maybe it is indeed trying to set up more textually by intertextual points themselves, the basis for these two different opinions. And here they are. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, whoever indulges in fasting is dubbed a sinner. This is in accordance with the view of Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar B'Rebbe, who stated, what is the implication of the phrase, and this is our verse here in chapter 6, verse 11, about the sin offering which is brought for someone for a Nazir who comes in contact with the dead. Make an atonement for him for that he sinned by the dead. And the Hebrew is nephesh, soul. By what soul then did he sin? We must conclude that it refers to denying himself the enjoyment of wine. If that's the case, he that merely denied himself the enjoyment of wine is dubbed a sinner. All the more so does this apply to the person who denies himself the enjoyment of the other pleasures of life, right? So Shmuel's opinion seems to be reading this verse a little bit exegetically, homiletically, that the sin that he did was not the sin of coming in contact with the dead. It was the sin of sinning against himself by putting himself in this Nazirite condition in which he doesn't enjoy everything that life has to offer. And this is a minimal case. Imagine if you went further than the Nazirite and denied yourself other pleasures. That would be a really big problem. So the Nazirite is somehow framed for us as a problematic thing because of denying yourself even one pleasure of life, which is the pleasure of wine. And then Rabbi Elazar says, he is called holy. As it is written, he shall be holy and shall let the locks of his head grow. If then this man who merely denied himself the enjoyment of wine is nevertheless called holy, how much more does this apply to the man who denied himself enjoyment of other things, right? All he did was not drink wine, and we call the Nazir holy. So this shows us that there's a holiness to asceticism, and how much the more so, the more you deny yourself, the holier you'll be. But then how does Rabbi Elazar explain away the fact that the Torah calls him a sinner, sher chatal hanefesh? Well, go back to the plain sense of the reading. That's because he defiled himself by coming in contact with the dead. The sin, even if inadvertent, right? He needs to bring atonement for the fact that he came in contact with the dead. Doesn't need to bring atonement for having sinned against himself by denying him pleasures. In fact, that's a holy act. Okay, I'm going to pause here before we go further in the text just to see if anyone has an initial reaction to this kind of framework. Is there a way to, can we bridge these two? Do you initially incline, either personally or based on Jewish sources that come to mind, more towards the idea of the power of asceticism, or the power of enjoyment of this world's pleasures? Nathan, go ahead. We don't hear you yet. Go ahead and unmute.
I don't have an answer to your question, at least not right now. I haven't thought it through yet, but I just want to point out that Rabbi Eliezer in the Midrash we just quoted, he doesn't respond to the question that Nechama asks earlier, which is, there's a chata regardless of whether you were in contact with a maid or not. And so Nechama says that, but so she's 100% right that there's a machlokas tanaim about this. But one of them deals with all the psukim and one of them doesn't.
Right. You're saying Rabbi Elazar, who explains away that that pasuk in Yud Aleph, still has to deal with the fact that there's a chatat in pasuk Yud Daled.
Right.
Yeah. Excellent point. Good. Thank you. I don't have an initial answer to that question. I don't know if it's discussed further on in the debates amongst those positions, so we have to keep an eye out for that. Thank you. Dad, go ahead.
So I'm looking at her very first sentence. She said, refers to this as a strange chapter, which has excited the attention and interest of many commentators. I think the excitement is hers. Here she found in the Talmud 2 rabbis who disagree with each other. And then she's going to go further and find the Rambam and the Ramban. And she has this issue, and they're not slight differences, but exact opposite opinions. And I think that's what excited her.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the kind of tone of what excited the attention and interest of many commentators, as opposed to just awakened or sparked. It definitely has a much stronger energy in that language choice. And we don't know exactly how worked up they got, but we see that she devoted an essay to this, so it clearly was of interest to her to want to draw out further. Nathan, do you want to add something, please?
Yeah, to what your father just said. I want to argue with it. You could amplify this for me. There's nothing more exciting to a brisker than having a machlokas.
Yes,
so I think your father's onto something.
Yes, totally. Yes, I remember a friend saying to me that he went, this was his first year in yeshiva, and he went to one of his teachers and he said, like, I found a contradiction in the Rambam. And the teacher said, oh no. And he was so confused because he was taught, like, you're supposed to find contradictions. And the teacher was, just sort of countering by saying, well, we do want everything to make sense. So, don't stop there, like, resolve the contradiction. Yes, it's what excites different people in learning is I think a great thing to think about. Okay, good. Let's go further. Okay, so and now, as my dad already indicated, good job reading ahead. So we're now going to sort of translate this Machloket Tanaim into medieval commentaries. So Maimonides, the Rambam, presents Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar's view in various parts of his works. In the 8 chapters, Shmona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avot, he states, our Torah, about which King David stated, the Torah of the Lord is perfect, making wise the simple. Torah Hashem Tamima, right? Eventually, Machkimat Peti, making wise the simple. Advocates no mortification. Its intention was that man should follow nature, taking the middle road. He should eat his fill in moderation, drink in moderation. He should dwell amidst society in uprightness and faith, and not. He should, let me emphasize that differently. He should dwell amidst society in uprightness and faith, and not in the deserts and mountains. He should not wear wool and hair, nor afflict his body. On the contrary, the Torah explicitly warned us regarding the Nazirite. Here the Rambam cites Eliezer HaKapar's interpretation of the chapter. Further in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides stated in Hilchot Deot, just sort of laws of, attitudes, healthy practices and behaviors, and perspectives on life. The Rambam says, if a person should argue, since envy, passion, and pride are evil, then shall I divorce and separate myself utterly from them, till I eat no meat, nor drink wine, nor marry, nor reside in a comfortable dwelling, nor wear fine clothes, but only wool and sackcloth, after the manner of the heathen priests. This also is an evil path, and forbidden it is to walk therein, as stated in the case of the Nazirite, quoting Eliezer HaKapar as above. Therefore, our sages commanded man to deny himself only the things denied him by the Torah. He should not inflict upon himself vows of abstinence on things permitted him. Thus, our sages stated, it is not sufficient for thee that which the Torah hath forbidden, but thou forbiddest thyself other things too. This includes those who are given to fasting. Our sages forbade a man to mortify himself with fasting. To such things King Solomon referred when he counseled, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldst thou destroy thyself? And just the opening, by the way, lest a person say, because kina v'tava v'hakavod v'chayotze b'hem motzin et ha'adam min ha'olam. It's a quote from Pirkei Avot. So don't follow that through to then choose this ascetic, self-negating lifestyle. Great. So and all of that again is framed on Rabbi Elazar HaKapara's position on this idea that the Torah warned us regarding the Nazirite, that the Torah, stated this idea in the case of the Nazirite. So he's bringing the Nazir, the Torah's attitude to the Nazir as the sort of proof for the idea that any kind of adding on prohibitions over and above that which the Torah prohibited is ill-advised. However, now again, using that Gemara in Tanit with the two different sides emphasizing different sections of the passage, now we have to come from the other side, Rabbi Elazar's position. However, how is it to be explained that the Torah does call the Nazirite holy? Nachmanides takes a wholly different attitude in this holy. I don't know if that in English was an intended pun, I doubt it, but it's there it is. Nachmanides takes a wholly different attitude in this matter, pulls apart from the middle natural way advocated by the Rambam. Commenting on the Nazirite's need to bring a sin offering, Nachmanides adheres to the plain sense of the scriptures, stating that, feel free to read this to yourselves for a moment while I take a short break, and I'll be right back. Okay, so here's the Ramban. Nachmanides adheres to the plain sense of scriptures, stating that this man sins against himself when he forsakes his vows of abstinence, when the days of his separation are fulfilled. He had separated himself to be holy unto the Lord, and by rights he should always continue to live a life of holiness and separation to God, in accordance with the verse, and I raised up your sons for prophets, and of your young men for Nazirites. There, the Nazirite is equated to the prophet. Similarly, the Torah states, all the days of his separation he shall be holy unto the Lord. Now that he returns to defile himself with worldly passions, he requires atonement. Okay, so this is the Ramban really going on the, not even the easy case of the coming in contact with the dead, interrupting the Nazirite vow, but even the end, in fact, the emphasis being the end, that the chatat that's offered, the sin offering that's offered at the end, is reflecting the fact that this person is actually sinning against himself. It's interesting. That's sort of the language of verse 11, chata al hanefesh, which was interpreted as sin against himself. But he's also applying it here to when the days of his separation are fulfilled, when his vow is complete. He brings a sin offering because it was a sin to end that period. How wide indeed is the chasm that separates Maimonides' approach from Nachmanides? By the way, just sort of offer a little thought here for consideration, which is while it's clear that the Ramban, holds the Nazir in a high esteem, maybe at some level we can slightly close the gap by saying, the sin is taking this on and then stopping it. Meaning it might not be for everybody, but if you do choose to take it on, once we have the principle in Jewish law, ma'alin bakodesh ve'ein moridin. We go up in levels of holiness and not down. It's not necessarily a mandate that one must always go up. It's just saying if there's a directionality, it should be up and not down. So maybe there's a slight moderation of the Ramban that could say the Nazirite vow is not for everybody, but if you're going to take it because you're going to choose this life, then don't back out of it. Now, again, that's really only one approach. There's a different approach, which very much sees it as, and I think the Torah presumably more than the Ramban does see it as specifically a temporary thing, that whatever purpose it serves is supposed to be time limited. But maybe we can read the Ramban a little bit as saying, whatever that elevated status is for the Nazirite, it's the key thing is that once you've adopted it, it's a sin to abandon it. That doesn't mean that everyone can or should adopt it. So a little thought to consider as we go. So how wide indeed is the chasm that separates Maimonides' approach from Nachmanides'? Maimonides regards the very act of becoming a Nazirite as a sin, right? The Torah warned us about it. Nachmanides, the act of forsaking the Nazirite vow, as we just saw. We shall conclude here by citing a third approach from the work of Solomon, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this last name, which is Midrashei HaTorah, collection of Midrashim. And here it is. But again, on verse 11, right, the sin offering, Asher Chatal HaNefesh, for having sinned against the soul, whether that's because of having come in contact with the dead or against himself. So he explains, or this Midrash explains, for that which he sinned, for the fact that his passions got the better of him, till he was driven to abstain from wine, to subdue his material desires and bodily wants, and deny himself the legitimate enjoyment of wine that makes glad both God and man. I'm not sure about the God part here, just out of curiosity, right? He's at some level presumably quoting, I didn't see the Hebrew original, but quoting the pasuk, Yain yisamach levav enosh, wine makes glad the heart of man. I'm not sure where the God part fits in. Okay, according to the latter opinion, this last one, the sin is not in becoming a Nazirite or in ceasing to be one. The sin referred to concerns that which preceded the Nazirite vow. Previous inability to control and discipline his desires within the bounds imposed by the Torah had made it necessary for the person concerned to restrict himself even further and vow himself to abstinence. The Nazirite vow was thus a necessary but extreme medicine for spiritual ills, right? So, there we're reading, there's a precursor, there's a prior scenario which the Torah doesn't tell us about, right? It just tells us, if a person would separate themselves and, establish this Nazirite vow, but we're understanding that the motivation for that must have been prior sins. And now we're saying, therefore, at the end, when they come to offer, a sin offering at the end, that's really not for having chosen to become a Nazirite, because it's in and of itself problematic and immoderate, extreme. And it's not for having ended the period of Naziritehood, which, for the Ramban was a mistake because that's or for the opinion in the rabbinic literature in the Gemara, Rabbi Elazar, to end it is a mistake because that's a state of holiness, but rather it's sort of the sin offering for the mistakes which drove one need to engage in this temporary abstinence to sort of rebalance the scales. I think that's a really thought-provoking third position which she brings for us. Okay, I saw Lance had a hand up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Professor Leibowitz and all of these other people have one version of the Nazarite. However, in Judges, there's another version, Judges 13:7. Do not drink freshly pressed or intoxicating wine. Do not consume anything ritually defiled, for the boy shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb until the day of his death. And Judges 16:17, he confided to her everything in his heart and told her, no razor has ever been wielded over my head, for I'm a Nazarite of God from my mother's womb. Now, there's got to be something here that's off, because how can you have like Nazarites who are Nazarites for 10 minutes and Nazarites who are Nazarites for their whole lives? And why isn't there any mention of Nazarites who are there for their whole lives?
Any mention where in this
In
this
these
chapter?
essays, in these articles, in the Talmud where we're talking about? Why don't they talk about, this is in Judges, okay?
Right.
It's
Which
strange to me.
this accords with Dara's question that she put in the chat about this idea of lifelong Nazaritehood.
Oh, okay, I didn't read the chat, sorry.
Just quickly checking. Hold on a second. There is, I believe, something called Nazirut Shimshon, which is based on the case of Shimshon, and it is like a lifelong Nazarite status. Those who recently did Daf Yomi, did Tractate Nazir, and may have a better handle on this. I haven't gotten to it in Mishnah Yomi yet for another year, but I think that there is a status of lifelong Nazirut. I remember that the Mishnah, I think it is, comments that the default Nazarite period is 30 days, but I think there is a possibility of lifelong Nazirut. Now, obviously, if it is the case of Shimshon was parentally induced, right? So lifelong meaning from birth would obviously be a choice that someone would have to make for you for an initial period of time. But I think that an adult could choose a lifelong Nazarite status and then would, right, but I think you're absolutely right, Lance, that the Torah seems to be assuming, in this framework, seems to be assuming a temporary status because it has the rituals prescribed for an endpoint. And I think that I don't know that the Torah ever, the Chamisha Chomshei Torah ever describes a perpetual Nazaritehood. But there we have it in Judges, and I think in the rabbinic period, absolutely, it's recognized as a possibility. Bracha and then Nathan.
I'm not really sure exactly what I'm thinking right now. I'm just wondering, in terms of the idea of this sin of stopping being a Nazarite, even though it was prescribed for a period of time, whether someone can sincerely go into it wanting to be on a holier status and feeling a need for that, but end up like almost going through the motions and feel like they've put in the time and now they're good with that, as opposed to being as opposed to valuing taking on a little bit more of that sense of connection to the holy when they leave it. So I'm sort of seeing that nuance.
Beautiful, right? It certainly is the case, if I'm understanding you right, that the nature of human beings is to become, as once we establish routine, is to lose the novelty or specialness of something. Once it becomes routinized, it's very hard to maintain its uniqueness. And so the notion of having the Nazarite period be temporary almost allows it to be more effective and then cease and then one could pick it up again against, if we're assuming that it's a constructive spiritual state, then there's a benefit to its temporariness. It reminds me when I came to the Bait almost 15 years ago, I don't remember the exact historical circumstances. We were saying 2 additional chapters of Tehillim at the end of davening for some prior situation that had been going on in the state of Israel. And I struggled with that. When does one decide to stop doing that? Not because everything is fine, but because then what happens when there's, as inevitably happens, although we wish it would not, a new state of struggle? Do we add 2 more chapters of Tehillim? There's almost, an importance to saying things are better enough that we're going to pull this back, because otherwise it just becomes folded in and doesn't sort of carry its unique status. So that's not a perfect analogy, but I absolutely appreciate what you're saying, and I think that has to be considered, right, when we think about the Nazirut as achieving this state of holiness. Is that how durable is that, at least at a conscious level? Maybe we can say, if we might take the approach, and the Ramban might be advocating for that approach, that there's something inherent about it, whether you feel it or not. But at the level of conscious feeling and experience, it's hard to imagine that perpetual state can awaken that. It's just one additional little thought. I always, whenever I'm in shul for a hanachat tefillin, where a bar mitzvah boy typically is putting on tefillin for the first time, I always sort of thank them, because it's a moment in which I pause and think like, wow, this is something special. Through the lens of someone doing it for the first time, I sort of reappreciate the fact that we're wearing little excerpts of the Torah on our arms for those who wear tefillin. And, it's very easily becomes rote. And so sort of journeying along with someone who's doing it for the first time gives that opportunity. Nathan, and then Lance again.
So I just want to add something to what Lance and Dara was saying earlier. I guess we don't have a lot of experience throughout Jewish history of people who were Nazirim, which I think is part of why we're not sure whether Nazir is a positive or negative thing to do. And Shimshon is kind of a questionable character, whether he's a positive or negative. But there was a personality a couple generations ago, a student of Rav Kook, who was called the Nazir, Hanazir.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was viewed as a very holy person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to answer Dara's question, I think he took it on for life.
Yes. Yeah. Was he, ask the typical question, was he viewed as holy because he became a Nazir? Or, is the Nazirut an expression of his already recognized holiness? How do those interplay with each other? But
I think the latter.
Yeah. Great. Lance, go ahead.
Is it possible that the Nazirite is a caricature of a priest?
Say more about how you're using the word caricature.
A cartoon, a satirical parody. I have no idea why that would be, but if you look at the Nazirite, he has certain aspects that are identical to the aspects of the priest, and many aspects that are not identical. And I find this curious. It's a curious character.
Yeah.
It's like having a talking donkey, which you also find in Numbers.
Mm-hmm.
It's just curious. And from my point of view, of course, David Weiss Livni, corruption of the Torah, I feel there's absolutely no consistency whatsoever in these texts.
Mm-hmm.
And we have absolutely no idea. It looks like it's all one time frame, but from my point of view, it can't be.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with the professors rather than the rabbis on this point. Look, if you read Torah.com, you'll find that there are many, many rabbis who are really caught between science and religion. And it's a very, very difficult trap, if you will, to escape from.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how you can be both. I believe there's an unbridgeable gap between a professor and a rabbi, but that's my prejudice.
Thank you. Great thoughts. And great shout out for the Torah.com, which, by the way, just commemorated its 10th anniversary this past Shavuot. And we had the privilege of hosting there were one or two people who were behind it, but Rabbi David Steinberg, who's a Bayit community member for Shavuot. So
How about Zev Farber?
Yep. I think he's less primarily involved now, although I think he was in at the ground level. So yeah, these are deep efforts on one of the really challenging questions. I think, as you said, exactly, the challenging question is some attempt to synthesize, to adopt one stance or the other, traditional stance or the scholarly academic stance, text critical stance. I'm not being dismissive of either of those, but those are easier in some level than attempting to try to integrate or synthesize those two.
Is that the same as Torah Umada?
No, I would say not. Torah Umada is not at all a philosophy, as I understand it, that incorporates that type of scholarship, text critical scholarship. I think it integrates the sciences in the sense of what we call now STEM or STEAM sciences and philosophy and humanities, but I think would completely prioritize Torah over Mada in that sense, or offer its own Mada to how one looks at the composition and authorship of the Torah. So, but it's great question. It's a great question. I think one could offer a critique, arguably, of Torah and Mada in that sense, saying that the Mada is inconsistent or incomplete when it comes to that question, but there's obviously a counter argument there as well. All right, great. Just of course note that there are some good thought questions at the end, and you have those for further study. And I also I want to apologize for overscheduling Mincha Marav. We're going to adjust the time for the last few weeks. I'm not usually in shul on Monday nights, but I want to make sure everyone can attend fully, and we try not to ever have shul conflicts with davening. So we'll probably be more like 8:50 or so. So keep an eye on email. With the Nechama ones being a little shorter, we can hopefully still end by our 9:30 end time. So thanks everybody. Enjoy another week of learning, and now finally getting to hear all of the long Parashat Naso with some thoughts on Birkat Kohanim and Nazir from Nechama in our back pockets. So have a great night, everybody. Love to mom and dad, and good night to all. Bye.